Welcome to Alabama Short Stories, when you're a little behind on your Alabama history. I'm your host, Sean Wright. On the south side of Red Mountain in Shades Valley, Lane Park borders the quaint Mountain Brook village with its shops and restaurants. When you approach the property on Cahaba Road, you can take a right onto Lane Park Road, which will take you to the entrance of the Birmingham Botanical Gardens. If you had continued straight on Cahaba Road, the Birmingham Zoo would be on your left and the Botanical Gardens on your right. What stands out almost immediately are gardens that look to be from another country, specifically Japan. There's a grove of bamboo, an arching red bridge, and distinctly Japanese buildings. It seems so out of place among the coffee shops and fitness studios in the surrounding area. Why would there be a Japanese garden in Birmingham? Before answering that question, let's go back in history a bit. The city of Birmingham had fully purchased the land where the zoo and gardens are by 1902 and named it Red Mountain Park. In 1934, it was renamed Lane Park in honor of Mayor A.O. Lane, who was instrumental in purchasing the land. Various groups, such as church groups and garden clubs, helped add to Lane Park over the years. The Works Project Administration, or WPA, constructed fish hatcheries on the west side of the property. The zoo would encircle this feature when it opened in 1955. The zoo had been willed into existence by Mayor Jimmy Morgan, and the zoo would be named in his honor over his repeated objections. Morgan had his eye on the east side of the property. He dreamed of developing a large garden in the city, and the east side of the park seemed ideal. There was one problem with that part of the park. It was already being leased to Harry Weaver, who operated a golf driving range and carpet golf course. He was notified that his lease was going month to month, and the writing was on the wall. But Weaver was not going down without a fight. "I've got $20,000 invested in that property, and I'm not going to be bullied out of my business," said Weaver. Weaver would soon be out of business despite the bravado. But his legacy lived on, as golf balls would be found for decades. Despite opposition from the Birmingham Parks and Recreation Board, Morgan moved forward with his idea for a garden. And in 1960, he commissioned Henry Toucher, curator of the Montreal Botanical Gardens, to develop a master plan for what would become the Birmingham Botanical Gardens. The main feature of his plan was a 300-foot-long glass greenhouse that would become the largest conservatory in the Southeast. Designed by noted Birmingham architect Charles Macaulay, the conservatory opened in 1961 while other areas of the master plan were being developed. Jack Parsons of Tarrant, Alabama had joined the U.S. Navy after World War II and was stationed in occupied Japan. He met and fell in love with Riko Orihara in Sasebo, Japan. They married in 1950, and Jack called her Katie. Their first child was born in 1953, and the next year, Jack was discharged from the Navy, and they planned to settle in Birmingham. Jack had been telling Katie all about Birmingham, but she was worried about how she would be received. Alabama was not very tolerant of minorities in the 1950s, and it had only been 9 years since the Japanese had surrendered, ending World War II. She needn't worry. Her in-laws and neighbors accepted Katie, and she spent her time raising her family, which had grown with the addition of a second son. Katie enjoyed tending a garden that she and her mother-in-law had planted. She became busy and was asked to teach flower arranging and demonstrate ceremonial tea pourings for groups across the city. It wasn't long before the family went back to Japan. Katie's father had fallen ill, and Jack was able to be reactivated with the Naval Reserve in Japan. The family continued to grow as their third child, a daughter, was born. Katie's father died the next year. And around this time, Katie started to have daily headaches. They became so bad that they returned to the United States to seek better medical treatment. They wanted to return to the life they had in Birmingham, but Jack needed work. They moved to Miami in hopes that Jack would find work and that the milder climate would help with Katie's headaches. A fourth child, a daughter, was born in Miami. The headaches persisted, and examinations and x-rays found nothing. The headaches began to affect Katie's life more and more. It was 1961 when things got so bad that Katie underwent surgery, revealing a malignant tumor in her brain. Jack could not take care of Katie's increasing needs while he worked and raised his 4 children, so the next year, Katie was admitted to a nursing home in Atlanta for terminal cancer patients. She spent her time writing poetry, and when Jack could be with her, she would tell him of her dream to have a garden in her memory in Birmingham. Word got out about her dream, and her friends in Birmingham rallied around her and started raising money for a Japanese garden. The idea took off when garden clubs from around Alabama got behind the idea. Garden club members in Birmingham would dress in kimonos and collect donations for the gardens. They were joined by local Japanese American garden club members who had been friends with Katie Parsons and wanted to help fulfill her dream. A Japanese garden was probably part of the master plan that Henry Tusher had prepared for the botanical gardens, but it wasn't a priority. But once word got out about Katie Parsons' dream, the Japanese gardens moved to the top of the list. Now, the only problem was that they didn't have anyone with the skills to develop the area correctly. Local architect Darcy Tatum had been selected to work on the project. He hired Buffy to create a master plan and turn the south end of the Botanical Gardens property into a Japanese garden. Masahi Buffy Mirai was born in San Francisco. He spent years in Japan studying Japanese gardens and landscaping. Buffy was a talented artist who worked on the Japanese film Sayonara and designed the Japanese sets for the movie Around the World in 80 Days. He was living in Missouri when he was contacted about working on the project. This may have been a little more special for him. The story of the Japanese girl struck my heart, said Buffy. The year before work started on the Japanese garden, the World's Fair had opened in New York City. There were 140 pavilions representing 80 nations. Japan's pavilion highlighted a century of progress showing their rapid emergence into the industrial age. At one end of the pavilion was a tea house used to show the crowds what a Japanese tea ceremony was. The building was much larger than a traditional tea house, so visitors could walk through and observe the ceremony. The New York World's Fair would end its 2-year run on October 17, 1965. Buildings and attractions throughout the fair were sold or donated to cities across the United States. Mrs. Ernest Henderson had seen the tea house during her visit to the World's Fair, and she thought it would look great in Birmingham's Japanese gardens. She mentioned the idea to Jimmy Morgan, and he thought it was a great idea. He promptly called on Alabama Senator John Sparkman to see if they could make it happen. Morgan flew to New York to meet Sparkman and Japanese embassy officials to find out what it would take to get the tea house to Birmingham. Two things stood in the way. One was a commercial enterprise that had already claimed ownership. They had plans to turn the building into a restaurant. The second was money. The budget was tight in Birmingham, and every dime was spent on the gardens. The tea house cost the Japanese government $50,000 to build in 1964 money. It would cost another $10,000 to move it to Birmingham. Garden officials did not have the money. Well, the stars lined up, and Senator Sparkman soon announced that the tea house would be donated by the Japanese government and the tea house builder, Shoshi Sen, who had learned of Birmingham's plan to develop a traditional Japanese formal garden. It probably sounded better to him than being turned into a restaurant. Sparkman called Morgan, who was on his honeymoon in Florida. Morgan was so excited he was ready to pack up and go wherever he was needed to facilitate the move. We assume he took his bride with him. The Birmingham Association of Home Builders and associate members would donate materials and supervise the projects, starting with building the foundation. All they needed was to find the money to ship the house to Birmingham. Local architect Fritz Whaley, vice president of the Botanical Gardens, had already made a trip to the World's Fair to inspect the tea house. He would supervise the dismantling and move the building. Now, if you don't know the name Fritz Whaley, you may know the blue roof church he designed that was located on Montclair Road and has since been torn down. In the 1970s, Whaley purchased a 1930s-era parking garage on 10th Terrace South. He used part of it for his design office and the rest as storage for his architectural antiques. It is now known as the Garages. You may have had a sandwich or a drink there and not known you were sitting among his collection. And the money? An anonymous donor made a $10,000 memorial gift to cover the delivery cost. The tea house arrived in Birmingham on December 10, 1965. Now, while researching this story, I had heard rumors that there was a tax lien on the tea house and that Fritz Whaley and accomplices dismantled the building and took it out of state in the dark of night. I was disappointed not to be able to verify that story. Even still, securing the tea house was a little touch and go for a while. The Japanese tea house was reassembled in Birmingham, and the gardens were completed just in time for the Birmingham Festival of Arts opening, which chose Japan as its honoree. The festival kicked off with a formal opening of the Japanese gardens on May 5, 1967. Ambassador to the United States, Ryuichi Takeuchi, and Madame Takeuchi of Washington, D.C., participated in the dedication of the tea house, which also included a tea ceremony conducted by a native Japanese tea master. But what happened to Riko Orihara Parsons, better known as Katie? She never saw the completed gardens. Katie knew she would die, and as much as she loved Birmingham, she wanted to die in her home country of Japan. Jack Parsons could not financially take her back to Japan, but Katie's story had spread across the country and even to Japan, and he figured he could make it happen. Jack enlisted the help of U.S. Representative George Huddleston of Alabama. The Japanese embassy promised to help, and Japan Airlines agreed to bring her home with the help of their employee contributions. In January 1964, Jack took Katie back to Japan, where her mother would care for her in her dying days. When they landed, thousands of Japanese men and women greeted Katie at the airport. Japanese mothers across Japan had a special interest in this story. Many of their daughters had married American servicemen and had moved to the United States. With one of these daughters coming home to die in their home country, these mothers were comforted by her return. I thought the story was going to end there. A Japanese woman moves to Birmingham and falls in love with the city. She finds out she has brain cancer, and her dying wish is to have a Japanese garden created in her memory. The city rallies around her dream to build the gardens and secures a Japanese tea house from the 1964 New York City World's Fair. And the gardens had become a highlight of Birmingham for decades. The end. In his April 10, 1970 People and Things column, Claude Duncan of the Birmingham Post-Herald wondered what happened to the Parsons family after Katie flew back to Japan, where she was expected to die in a short time. He wondered if they even mentioned Katie at the Japanese garden's dedication. There had been talk about calling it Katie's Garden or erecting a simple plaque in her memory, but nothing came of it. That column had other people wondering, and within a couple of days, a UPI reporter found Riko Katie Orihara Parsons living at her mother's home in Japan. The year after she returned to Japan, she underwent brain surgery. The operation was a success in that it cured her cancer, but she was paralyzed from the waist down. For whatever reason known only to Jack and Katie Parsons, the marriage was essentially over, and they divorced in a Miami court in September 1966. Riko Katie Orihara would live until 1981, 17 years after she went home to die. Not much is known about Jack Parsons and his family after Riko went to Japan. They lived in the Birmingham area until 1969 and ended up in Texas, where Jack Parsons died in 1985. That would be the end of the story, but when researching for this episode, I came across a letter from a Parsons daughter to the director of the Botanical Gardens in 1991. She was looking for information about her mother. The children, grown adults by this time, were unaware of the media frenzy surrounding their mother and the Japanese gardens. They had assumed their mother died shortly after returning to Japan and were shocked and saddened to find out that their mother had lived until 1981. We will never know why this information was kept from them when she was still alive. When you visit the Japanese gardens in Birmingham today, you will enter underneath the torii, a bright red gateway to heaven. It's a traditional garden gate that symbolizes the passing from the typical world to a sacred place. There is a kara-sansui, or dry landscape garden with rocks and gravel raked in swirls and curves. You may call it a Zen garden. And you might have even received a desktop version of this for Christmas one year. Two distinct bridges cross Long Life Lake, which is great for viewing the koi and turtles. And then there's the tea house. It's not the tea house that was part of the New York World's Fair. That tea house was only built as a temporary exhibit and not to withstand the Alabama weather for a quarter century. In 1992, the tea house was dismantled, and its parts were saved and recycled in a Japanese tradition called metate. A new tea house, also called toshinan, which means a place where the light of mutual understanding is lit in men's heart, was built in Japan by Kazunori Tago and his team. It was then taken apart and shipped to Birmingham, where they reassembled it. If you ever saw the original tea house, this one is much smaller and more in line with traditional tea houses. If you've never been to the Birmingham Botanical Gardens, you need to drop everything and go. It's a beautiful place. Best of all, admission is free. And when you visit, Think of Katie Parsons and how her dream helped drive the creation of the Japanese gardens. She may have quickly been forgotten when she returned to Japan, but her spirit lives on within these gardens. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Alabama Short Stories Podcast. If you enjoyed listening, I would appreciate it if you would rate it and leave a review on Apple Podcast and Spotify if you listen there. And if you know someone who might like to hear these stories, share this episode with them and encourage them to subscribe. You can also support the podcast by purchasing the companion book from Amazon.com, which features the first 3 seasons of the podcast. Thanks again, and see you next time on Alabama Short Stories.